Okay, thank you very much, Bina. Thank you for those kind words of introduction. And thank you to GCAP for kindly inviting me to be with you today. I'm going to make some opening remarks to set the stage for the understanding of inequality. There is a complicated assumption about justice being equated with addressing inequalities, but I'm sure you know that it's much more complicated than that. But allow me to make some remarks to set our understanding for inequality. The inequality which we face in the world today is very different from the inequality which has existed in the past. And it's important. Can you see my slideshow?
Yes, we can see.
Yes, yes.
Thank you. Okay, the inequality we have in the world today is quite different from the inequality which existed in the past. But it's important to emphasize that the inequalities which we have, especially between regions, has actually accelerated first about 5 centuries ago, and then especially in the last 2 centuries. So this is important for us to recognize that inequality is very much associated with the period after the so-called Industrial Revolution, now of the Industrial Revolution about 2 centuries ago. Firstly, you have a new type of imperialism, which begins to manifest itself in different ways. This is to be distinguished from the earlier imperialisms, which were not grounded in capitalism. And so you have a new type of imperialism which becomes, which is associated with capitalism from about the early 19th century. And this manifests itself in different parts of the world in different ways. But I think it's important for us to recognize this new imperialism and that the response to it begins in the global south. It does not begin in the global north. It does not begin with John Hobson. It does not begin with Vladimir Ilyich Lenin, but rather it begins with a lot of people. Importantly, for example, in the Muslim world, and we need to recognize, for example, that Said Jamaluddin al-Afghani began to write critically about imperialism, Western imperialism, particularly from about a century and a half ago. In India, in an Indian who was elected to the English Parliament, Dadabhai Nauroji, started writing about something he called drainage or drain theory. Basically conveying how the surplus was being drained from India to Britain. And this has subsequently been done. A lot of research has been done, most notably for India by Utsa Patnaik, but there have also been other attempts to do so for Africa, for example, by people like Walter Rodney, for Latin America, people like Eduardo Galeano, and there are others, of course, which I have no time to go through the whole list. Then you have a period of accelerated growth. Accelerated growth because of the changes in technology which were made possible by the Industrial Revolution. But it's very important to recognize that much of the investment to make that technological change possible was obtained precisely by taking from the global south. This is very clear in the case of India, for example, which had come under the control of the East India Company. It's clear in the case of Indonesia, which was under the control of the Dutch East Indies Company, and true of many other parts of the world. The next thing I think to recognize is that this development, therefore, under capitalist imperialism was very uneven throughout the world, uneven in different ways. Uneven because there were parts of the world which were being directly exploited by capital accumulation, involving capital accumulation. And there you had investments, but investments which resulted in exploitation. And then you had a lot of the world which was became the periphery, which was ignored. There were no investments in those parts of the world. And in both situations, you had poverty, but poverty involving different types of relations in society. And the result of all this, of course, is greater inequality, as I showed you in the first slide, and I'll show you in a little while. But the other thing, of course, is the use of mechanical energy, largely from the burning of fossil fuels. And this, of course, plays a very important role with planetary heating. Next, please. I don't know whether the slides are up or not. So if somebody could tell me that if the slide is up.
We can see.
Is it showing now, the fourth slide?
I can't see
Great
the slide.
Divergence.
Yes.
Great Divergence, 1700. Okay. So this gives a sense of the kind of divergence which was beginning to take place between Western Europe and then later the Western offshoots of Europe. And here I'm referring, of course, to the settler colonies of the West, such as in Canada and Australia and New Zealand and so on and so forth. All these were very, very important. They have accelerated growth, but these were settler colonies. And even in the global south, what we call the global south today, there have been important settler colonies. I'm not sure what's going on.
Sorry, please go ahead. There was somebody who unmuted.
Okay, so we have the growing inequalities taking place from the beginning of the 18th century, and this grow very, very rapidly during the period of the Industrial Revolution and thereafter. So and this next, please. So the result is that by the end of the 20th century, or the second half of the 20th century, you have huge differences. Now, the period after the end of the 20th century, after the end of the Second World War, is very interesting because you have what some people call the golden age. The Keynesians in particular like to refer to this as a golden age, a period characterized by reconstruction of the parts of the world which were affected by World War II, especially in the in the West, but also very importantly the decolonization of much of the global South, especially in Asia and then later in Africa. So this process of decolonization had very, very different social, political, and economic outcomes, but it's very important for us to recognize that it was a period which was generally characterized by rapid economic growth and by some reduction of inequalities. For example, due to agrarian reforms and so on. And interestingly enough, these agrarian reforms did not always take place where you had progressive regimes. You also had preemptive agrarian reforms in places like Japan, in places like South Korea, in places like Taiwan. And these agrarian reforms were deliberately promoted to preempt these parts of the world from being much more under leftist influences and so on. Next, please. Okay, so then the point I want to make here is that the arguments for trade integration begin to be made during this period. This is very important to understand, partly because we are so dominated by Western thinking and particularly by by US economic thinking. So in this period, you have many more arguments for trade integration, but it's also important for us to recognize the very complex relations which are taking place. So, one very conservative right-wing economist named Jagdish Bhagwati from India, for example, who is an advisor to the Modi government, or was the advisor to the Modi government. Jagdish Bhagwati wrote in 1959, he wrote about immiserizing growth. In other words, people, especially small producers, were producing more and more and more, but they did not really earn much more. And then hence the term immiserizing growth. Of course, some of his subsequent work was of a different nature, but it's important to recognize that even so-called trade liberals like Jagdish Bhagwati and others, many of their arguments are actually recognize some of these problems associated with this. From the middle of the 20th century, you had very important writings such as that by Hans Singer and Raoul Prebisch, from Argentina, who basically recognized that the terms of trade, in other words, the way in which trade, international trade is organized, the prices you get for primary commodities versus manufacturers, the terms of trade were favoring manufacturers versus primary commodities. And another economist, also from the Global South, originally from the Caribbean, from St. Lucia, W. Arthur Lewis, wrote about the terms of trade for tropical agriculture against temperate agriculture. So tropical agriculture was basically experienced lower prices compared to temperate agriculture. Now, so the kind of argument you often hear in more conventional economics actually is often self-serving. It's very selective, and there is a great deal of evidence to the contrary. More recently, from the end of the 20th century, you find that developing countries have been producing goods, most spectacularly, of course, countries like China, but even before that, other developing countries. And since then, other countries and India is supposed to be embarking on a period of made in India, and all these slogans about industrialization. But all that, which was supposed to reduce the cost of manufacturers for the global north and for the rest of the world, played a very important role in moderating inflationary tendencies due to many factors. And this basically has meant that the wages in the global south have not increased commensurate with the increased productivity in the global south. And what we find as a consequence is that conditions of living have improved in the global south because of the work and the productivity of agriculture, of industry compared to agriculture. But at the same time, they have not improved significantly enough. And this, of course, is captured in various different ways, including the very famous collapse of the building in Dhaka in Bangladesh several years ago, which basically testifies to the working conditions in which many workers in the global south are subjected to. Industrialization of the global south has been very significant, very important, but this has also meant some deindustrialization of the global in the global north. Now, to be sure, it is not this alone, but also other factors such as the increased automation, as well as more recently, the increased application of machine learning, artificial intelligence, and so on and so forth. This has significantly increased productivity, but also, very importantly, reduced the need for human labor. So whereas the exploitation of labor was so crucial to the development of capitalism for most of the last 2 centuries, now we find a period where labor is becoming almost irrelevant to the accumulation of capital. And in fact, in some places of the world, there is this systematic efforts to reduce the population. There is a great deal of alarm in the West, for example, about the continued population growth in Africa and so on. And this is likely to continue for some time to come. Next, please. Okay, this is a simple graph to give you a sense of how the terms of trade for primary commodities went down over the course of the 20th century. Next, please. And the next graph gives you a sense of how developing country manufactured goods have actually fared. They have trended downwards in general over the last since the end of the 20th century, and this trend has continued to the present period. Next, please. Okay, so this is something which often people don't talk about, but the term which became very popular from the end of the 20th century into the early 21st century is globalization. it has been wrongly equated with imperialism. Imperialism involves much more than globalization. And so we have a very curious situation right now where the Washington government is very much against globalization, but the government of Beijing is very much for globalization. And one very important development which has taken place over this period is that in the early period, globalization was very often associated with trade liberalization. But what we find in the recent period is that financial globalization has become extremely important. And this is captured by this bar chart. Next, please. Okay. So the consequence of this, of course, is a very significant net financial transfers from the global south to the global north. But, and next, please. What I want to emphasize here is that, in fact, while the general trend has been to go from the south to the north, through the international monetary system, which has been very much dollar dominated, there has been a significant flow of capital from the world to the US. Okay, so the US is actually not a net capital exporter, as many people presumed, but rather a significant importer of capital. And this works through the US-dominated international monetary system, and I won't get into that right now. But let me just emphasize that I'm not one of those who believes that de-dollarization is something terribly important to do in the present period. De-dollarization is unlikely to succeed in the short term, although in the medium term, it is likely to have important consequences in terms of weakening US hegemony. But it's not something where the global south has much impact. And I think it's a major distraction to put too much emphasis on the question of de-dollarization. Now, the next slide, please. Okay, so this, I want to emphasize that although there have been significant flows of finance from the north to the south. Yeah? Not a lot, but there have been significant flows. In fact, they do not contribute very directly to what economists call gross fixed capital formation. Fixed capital formation is the actual real investments. Okay, and we do not see all that much. So just because you have much more financial investments, you do not necessarily have more real investments. So let us not confuse one with the other. Next, please. Okay, so I want to emphasize that, in fact, contrary to the claims of the advocates of financial globalization, the flows have been not from the capital rich to the capital poor, but except for Southeast Asia, in fact, it has been from the capital poor to the capital rich. So at the end of the 20th century, a man named Michel Camdessus became the head of the IMF, and he advocated against the Articles of Association of the IMF. He urged developing countries to open up their capital accounts. And the result of opening up the capital accounts is that elites from the global south started taking out their money much more easily. And the result has been the further underdevelopment of the global south rather than the development of global south as promised. As a famous Malaysian economist who passed away many years ago used to say, this kind of economics is like opening a bird cage and expecting more birds to fly in than to fly out. Now, next, the cost of funds for the global south has not been lower as a consequence of capital account liberalization. And while some of the old sources of volatility and instability have been reduced, it's important to recognize that new sources have in fact been introduced. Next, please. Okay, this gives you a sense. This is a very old graph which has been updated by some friends, and it gives you a sense of the inequalities which happen. Now, when we think about global inequality at the global level, it's important to recognize that there's the inequality between the rich countries and the poor countries. So the rich countries are on the right-hand side of the diagonal axis. Okay, and the poor countries are the front of the diagonal axis. Now, if you look at the richer classes, they're on the left-hand side of the horizontal axis. And on the right-hand side are the poorer people. So the rich people in the rich countries are captured by that skyscraper in the far corner there. And the poor people in the poor countries, you can barely see because there's no real presence, so to speak. Okay. Next, please. So next, please. Okay, so it's important for us to recognize that these kinds of inequalities, which I've tried to represent in different ways, is also has important consequences for consumption. So if you look at these bars, the light blue bars are basically these bars represent the consumption of in the richest countries, the 20 richest countries in the world. And the consumption of the 20 poorest countries in the world is captured by that very light green, which you can barely see. Okay, so in 1960 or in the early 60s, it was 11 points, 11, 11,400 per capita compared to 212. Okay, now the ratio is even higher. The share of the poorest 20 countries has increased slightly from 212 to 267, whereas in the richer countries it has almost tripled from 11,000 plus to 32,000. Okay, so that gives you a sense that inequality has continued to increase over the period. Next, please. Okay, so here you get another look. You can see the same kind of representation of the rich countries versus the poor countries in terms of private expenditure, of consumption of meat and fish, animal protein, in other words, the energy, ownership of telephone lines, and so on and so forth. Next, please. Okay, so what I want to conclude with is to emphasize that the world has changed in very, very profound ways in the period since the end of World War II. We are talking of a period, as you know, recently there were celebrations to mark the end of World War II, 80 years since 1945. And this is a period mainly in the West. For Asia, however, especially for East and South, including Southeast Asia, the war ended in August. Yeah? The war ended in August when the Japanese surrendered. And it's important for us to recognize that this is a period where we thought the Second World War was the war to end all wars. And the United Nations was born with that promise and so on. Unfortunately, this has not been the case. And what we have seen in the period since then is the end of with the end, there's been a significant Cold War where many people died, and especially in the global South. More than 3 million, some people argue 4 million people died in Vietnam alone. Similarly, many millions of people died in some other countries, in the rest of Indochina, for example, in Cambodia and so on, but also elsewhere we have seen significant changes. But that period the end of the Cold War largely came to an end at the beginning of the 1990s. And subsequently, depending on how you look at the world, there was a celebration of the US victory, the victory of the West in the First Cold War, and this promise of the so-called end of history. This was just a metaphor to try to capture the fact that the so-called East had lost. And but what we have seen since then is a great deal of evidence that rather than the complete subjugation of the rest of the world, we have more evidence of what is often referred to as a multipolar world. This multipolar world implies a great number of new challenges which we need to deal with, because we're not talking about a single front, as in the Soviet bloc, for instance, during the First Cold War. What we see instead now is a very different situation, where, for example, there is no military alliance between, let us say, Russia, the Russian Federation, and China, and Iran, and so on and so forth. And this is very important because it implies that there is no intention of hegemony by these countries, but rather we have instead a multipolar world. But for President Trump, unlike some of his predecessors, he likes to go to deal with other countries on a one-to-one basis. And this is one reason why he refuses, for example, to deal with ASEAN as a group, or he refuses to deal with any other potential bloc from the developing countries, no matter how small these countries might be. Because this is the mentality of a bully. You can bully an individual, especially when the individual is alone, much more effectively than you can when they have numbers. And this, I think, is important for us to recognize. Now, the next thing to recognize, of course, is that there has been a significant rise of the right for about half a century now. And this has meant, for example, the rise of the economic ideas associated with Mrs. Thatcher and Ronald Reagan and so on and so forth, and resulted in a whole range of neoliberal policies. But those neoliberal policies are no longer enough to satisfy particularly the US. And so we find a great deal of effort by the current US administration, the Trump administration, which are captured by something called the Mar-a-Lago Accord, which is being promoted by the chief economic advisor to Donald Trump. If there's interest, we can talk about that later. But in other words, the right in the world, the right wing in the world, are able to fight among themselves because the resistance is largely gone or compromised, as we saw, for example, in other parts of the world. Another very important development, of course, is that you have the rise of the neocons, and the neocons the neoconservatives, who are very influential, are now being opposed by, sometimes they're called nationalists, sometimes they're called populists. I prefer to use a term which was coined in Sri Lanka around 1983. These are basically ethno-populists. These are ideologies which are inspired by a dominant group vis-a-vis minorities. In India, in many other parts of the world, in Brazil and so on and so forth, and of course in the West. And you have seen the rise of this kind of ethno-populist, ethno-nationalist groups. Another very important development is that in the past, the debate as far as US foreign policy, US hegemony is concerned, was between the so-called realists, people like Henry Kissinger, John Mearsheimer, and so on and so forth, versus the so-called idealists who were supposedly fighting for human rights and or democracy and so on and so forth. This was a lie, but the point is that many people believe that lie. Today, Trump has done something which is very important for us to take note of, and that he has redefined the differences between the so-called neoliberal globalists versus whatever he considers himself, and the kind of alliance which he's trying to build, particularly in the Western world, but also beyond. Note, for example, his very close relationship with Prime Minister Narendra Modi in India. Or note, for example, his encouragement in his first administration of people like Abe Shinzo in Japan, and so on and so forth. These are all people who subscribe to varying degrees to his own ideology, but more importantly, are prepared to work with the Trump administration and their allies in the present period. And of course, the leading example of that is Benjamin Netanyahu. Now, where are the rest? Unfortunately, they are very weak. We do not even, the non-aligned movement is almost non-existent. It is very little. I asked the Indian foreign minister what happened to India's support for the non-aligned movement, which was hosted, the conference was hosted in India in 1987. And he said, oh, that's the 20th century. That was Cold War. Now we no longer believe in the non-aligned movement. Instead, we are now talking about the Global South. But what kind of Global South do they talk about? Well, it's for us to think about this. My point about all this is that we now live in a very, very different world from which many of our ideas, which for economic justice, were being promoted. We are in a very small minority. The debates in the right wing in the West are not going to benefit the Global South in any significant degree. There is nobody concerned about economic justice at the international level. There are countries which governments in the West and beyond who are involved in competing for war. I would have begun this lecture if I was slightly more organized by wishing you salam alaikum, because it means peace upon you. But instead, we find in South Asia conflicts going on between neighboring countries in South Asia, and this is happening elsewhere in the world as well. All this feeds into this larger narrative where the Secretary of Defense of Donald Trump, Hexet, has basically said that he started off as a crusader. Okay, if you go to his website, you will see him undressed, with showing off his tattoos, showing off that he identifies with the Crusades of almost a millennium ago. And then he says, no, but today the Crusades have to be extended. The number one enemy is China, and the second enemy is what he calls political Islam. So this basically, and we also know that this political Islam ideology has led to not only the support for Israel, but also the selective support, for example, of the Daesh government, which now dominates Syria and so on. So we have a very different world. And we need to begin to think about building different types of coalitions at different levels. Among governments, the few progressive governments there are will need to build coalitions with others. And we need to understand the need for those kinds of coalitions. We also need to build coalitions at other levels, among political parties, among other movements, and of course among civil society movements which see themselves rather differently as providing an alternative. If you insist on the same terms and conditions for all types of cooperation, we are not going to get very far. And I think this is the big key challenge for us right now in a world where there is very, very little interest among most governments in terms of trying to improve economic justice, especially in the Global South. So that is a challenge for us, all of us here. Let me stop here and thank you very much. There's one last slide, but it's basically just for those of you who are interested in following some of these discussions which some of us are trying to conduct. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Jomo. I think everybody will agree that that was a very great lesson in history of tracing how we've ended up in this situation of such high differences or gaps within in economic inequalities, and then finally leading to the fact that only collective action or coalition building will actually help us to move forward. That was really interesting, and some things, even for me, it was really new and a new learning. Thank you very much for that. I'd now like to open the floor if there are any quick questions related to, I know there are a lot of comments from people for funding, etc., but I'm not going to go into those comments. But if others have any questions, queries, or suggestions purely based on what Jomo has just said, please feel free either to unmute yourselves or to put it in the chat box.
Can I put a comment here?
Yes.
Okay. My name is Firoz Alam. I am from Bangladesh. So really, it was a very good presentation. Really, really very eye-opening. Thank you, Jomo. But I have a question, that is the civil societies, like the NGOs is a big force in the present world because everywhere there are NGOs. But I find something wrong here. I'll tell wrong. It is because these NGOs are funded by the rich countries. They're taking fund from USA, UK, Netherlands, from that countries. And I feel that they have some kind of agenda. They have their kind of concept that they are implementing through these civil societies. So how far we can rely on these civil societies to change the world in a, in a better shape or bring the justice. Thank you.
Jomo, we
Shall
can
I
collect
respond?
a few questions and then you can respond, yeah, if that's fine. Anyone else?
In interest of time, I think Jomo can respond to
Okay.
this.
Okay, Jomo, you can respond to that, please.
Okay, thank you very much for that question from Bangladesh. Yes, indeed, civil society movements are very significant, but perhaps more significant in Bangladesh than in most other societies for a number of historical reasons. The fact that Bangladesh was one of the later countries to get independence, and the tendency of many of the donors to bypass the governments of Bangladesh for various reasons. And so civil society movements have been especially strong in Bangladesh. And also some of the innovations of the civil society movements have been extremely important and part of the strength they have. Right now, you can say that the government in Bangladesh is a civil society government. But I think it's very important for us to recognize that whatever our reservations about many of these civil society movements, remember that within every single movement, if it is a movement rather than an NGI, yeah, a non-government individual, it always involves a coalition. And there will be more honest people who are truly motivated by certain considerations, and there will be more, for want of a better term, opportunistic people. Who see an alternative career path in being a non-government funded and so on. So I think we need to distinguish that, and then we need to recognize that people may not necessarily because of where the money is coming from, but may honestly have differences of views. We need to have ways of distinguishing these problems and not making every little difference the source of conflict. There's a joke outside of South Asia among people all over the world. They say, you have two people, you have three people, you form a political party in South Asia. And then if you have four people, you will have a splinter party. I mean, it's a joke. It's a joke. It's an exaggeration and probably quite unfair. But I think it's important to you that we need to build a culture where we are able to have differences and settle these differences honestly. Because many of these differences are honestly held. However wrong and misled they are honestly held. And this is why I appreciate the ability of many people to change their views and to acknowledge where they are wrong. I mean, you take somebody like Jeffrey Sachs. Okay, Jeffrey Sachs has, in my view, changed his views on many things. Okay, but some people don't complain that, well, he doesn't criticize his own past. I mean, to me, I'm happy to have allies when at every stage of things, right? So you can be very, very picky. If we don't agree on 10 of my principles, then I won't accept you. I won't talk to you. I won't have anything nice to say about you, and so on and so forth. I think that's not the way we are going to move forward. I think we will need to have a different political culture, and to recognize that there will be differences which will not be reconcilable. And that's why I emphasize the need to organize on different issues. For example, if you take, for example, the what is happening in Gaza today, okay? Many people will say, "Oh, we cannot support what is happening in we cannot support the Hamas because Hamas led the thing. Hamas was responsible for October 7th." Despite the disproportionately of the you need to recognize, at least, if they are prepared to agree that the many people, the kinds of retribution which the Israeli authorities have taken and have destroyed. Let us admit it. They have destroyed Hezbollah and so on and so forth. We need to recognize that these are important differences which we are not going to resolve overnight. Okay.